She never planned to stop that evening, never imagined her tired walk home would turn into the moment that changed everything. But life has a strange way of placing us exactly where we're meant to be, even when we think we're just passing by. The sun was already slipping behind the tall buildings, leaving long shadows across the street, and the cold wind of early winter made her hug her jacket tighter as she crossed the empty sidewalk. It had been a heavy day at work, the kind of day that drains you in ways you can't even explain, and all she wanted was to reach home, take a warm shower, and forget the world for a little while. But then she saw him. He was sitting alone on the metal bench near the bus stop, hunched over like the weight of his whole life was resting on his back. His coat was torn at the sleeve, his shoes were worn out, and his hands were shaking in the cold as if each breath was a battle he was trying not to lose. People walked around him like he was invisible, like he didn't belong to the same world they lived in, and she might have done the same if something inside her hadn't stopped her feet at that exact moment. It wasn't pity, it wasn't fear, it wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, something that felt like her heart reached out before her mind could. She stood there for a second, watching him, trying to understand what made her pause. Maybe it was the way his shoulders rose and fell with each shivering breath, or maybe it was the silent loneliness around him, the kind that isn't loud but suffocates quietly. She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't walk away. She walked closer, her steps soft, careful, almost hesitant, as though she didn't want to frighten him or break whatever fragile piece of dignity he still held on to. He didn't look up at first. His eyes were fixed on the ground like he had forgotten how to meet another person's gaze. She cleared her throat gently and said, "Sir, are you okay?" Her voice wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the evening, it carried enough warmth to make him lift his head slowly, as if the question itself was something he hadn't heard in a very long time. His eyes told the story before his lips could move. They were tired, red at the corners, filled with years of pain he had learned to hide behind silence. She felt something inside her shift, quietly, deeply, like her heart recognized a kind of suffering she had never personally felt, but could somehow understand. She reached into her bag almost without thinking, and pulled out the warm coffee she had bought earlier. She hadn't even taken a sip yet, and now handing it to him felt like the most natural thing in the world. He stared at the cup for a moment, as if he wasn't sure it was really meant for him. His trembling fingers brushed against hers as he took it, and that tiny touch told her how cold he really was. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words came out thin and cracked like they were fighting their way through years of silence and hardship. She nodded softly, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she sat down beside him on the cold metal bench. People around them glanced quickly and then looked away, some with confusion, some with judgment, some with simple indifference. But she didn't care. In that moment, it felt like the world around them had faded into the background, leaving just the two of them in a quiet corner, where the only thing that mattered was the human connection between two strangers who were not so different after all. The old man held the cup with both hands, trying to warm himself through the thin layer of paper. Every sip seemed to bring him back to life just a little, and she watched him closely, feeling something heavy and unfamiliar settle in her chest. She didn't know him. She didn't know his story, but she knew he mattered, and she knew this moment mattered too. After a long silence, she asked gently, "Do you have somewhere to go?" His shoulders stiffened slightly and he looked down, shaking his head just once, a small, heartbreaking gesture that told her more than words ever could. His silence was louder than 1,000 explanations. It carried loss, exhaustion, and a kind of loneliness that made her throat tighten. She didn't push him, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply sat with him, letting the silence stretch without pressure, because sometimes the simple act of being seen is more powerful than any conversation. She felt him breathe differently, like he was slowly letting go of a fear he had been holding on to for too long. He finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "People don't usually stop." She turned to him and said softly, "They should." The way he looked at her in that moment, with surprise and a fragile kind of gratitude, made her realize that this wasn't just a stranger she had found on a cold street. This was someone whose life had been full of stories, memories, dreams, losses, moments of love and moments of despair. Someone who had lived enough to understand what being ignored does to the soul. Part 2. She didn't know how long they sat there in silence, only that the world around them seemed to soften and slow down, as if time itself had decided to give them this moment without rushing it. The streetlights flickered on one by one, washing the empty sidewalk in a pale, gentle glow. Cars passed occasionally, but their sound felt distant, almost muted. What wasn't muted was the quiet heaviness in the air, the kind that forms when two people want to speak but don't quite know where to begin. The old man held the warm cup of coffee close to his chest, as if it was the first warmth he had felt in days, maybe weeks. His hands still trembled a little, but not as violently as before. The steam rose slowly from the cup, drifting into the cold night like a fragile promise that things could still get better, even for someone who felt lost. She looked at him, studying his fragile frame, the deep wrinkles etched into his skin like a map of everything he'd survived. Something inside her whispered that this man had once lived a very different life, a life nothing like the one he was trapped in now, and she found herself wanting to know who he had been before the world turned its back on him. "You don't have to answer," she said finally, keeping her voice soft. "But is there someone I can call for you? Family, a friend?" He let out a faint, sad breath that wasn't quite a sigh but carried the weight of one. He stared at the ground for a long moment, and she wondered if he would speak at all. When he finally did, his voice was so soft she almost missed it. "No one's waiting for me anymore." Those words cut through her like cold wind. She didn't know what kind of loss could make a person say that so quietly, so matter-of-factly, as if it was a truth he had lived with for far too long. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to hurt him by digging into wounds that already bled on their own. He glanced at her with tired eyes. "People usually walk past," he murmured. "They look away fast, like they're afraid kindness might cost them something." She swallowed hard. She had seen it too. Cities full of people too busy, too afraid, too wrapped up in their own world to look at someone else's pain. She felt a strange embarrassment swell inside her, realizing she had walked past many people in need without stopping. But something about this man wouldn't let her keep walking today. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't even know exactly what she was apologizing for. Maybe for the world, maybe for herself, maybe for everything he had endured. He shook his head slightly. "Don't be. You stopped. That's more than most." She breathed out slowly, watching the cold air curl from her lips. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel special. She only felt human, and suddenly she was grateful for that. Grateful that her heart hadn't grown numb like so many others she'd seen. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The old man hesitated as if the question startled him, as if he hadn't heard his own name spoken kindly in a very long time. "Jonathan," he said quietly, voice trembling in a way that wasn't just from the cold. She smiled softly. "I'm Emily." His eyes softened when he heard her name, as though it reminded him of someone he once knew, someone whose memory lived somewhere deep inside the lonely chambers of his heart. "Emily," he repeated slowly, almost tasting the warmth of the word. "That's a good name." There was a long pause, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something unspoken was happening. Something gentle and fragile, like the slow opening of a door that had been locked for years. Emily felt it too. A shift in the air. The beginning of a connection she hadn't expected but wasn't willing to walk away from. "Jonathan," she said softly, "when's the last time you had something warm to eat?" His jaw clenched in a way that told her she had hit a truth he didn't want to say out loud. Instead of answering, he shrugged lightly, a small, defeated motion that carried more meaning than any explanation could. Emily felt a tightness in her chest. How long had he been fighting his battles alone? How long had he been surviving on nothing but willpower and worn-out memories? She looked at his frail body, at the exhaustion in his face, and she couldn't stop herself from asking, "Do you want me to get you something?" He opened his mouth as if to refuse, but the refusal never came. Instead, his face softened, and he lowered his head a little like he didn't want to appear needy. "If it's not too much trouble," he whispered. "It's not," she said immediately, her voice firm in a way she didn't use often. "It's not trouble at all." Jonathan blinked, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, gratitude, and something else, a kind of disbelief that someone still cared enough to stay. He took a slow breath and whispered, "You don't know how long it's been since..." Someone sat beside me. Emily felt her heart tighten again. She reached out gently and touched his arm in reassurance. "You're not alone tonight," she said. He looked at her long and deeply as if memorizing her face. as if trying to understand why a stranger would choose to see him when the world didn't. In that moment, beneath the cold night sky and the quiet glow of the streetlights, Emily and Jonathan became something neither expected, two lives crossing at the exact moment they both needed a reminder that humanity still existed, and neither knew it yet. But this small conversation was about to reveal a truth that would change Emily's life forever. Part 3. Emily didn't rush him, didn't push for answers, didn't pressure him to speak. She simply sat there, letting the night settle gently around them as the warm streetlights cast a soft glow on Jonathan's worn face. After a few quiet minutes, he took a deep breath as if trying to gather the scattered pieces of courage he hadn't used in years. His fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a story that had lived locked inside him for far too long. "I wasn't always like this," he began slowly, staring ahead at the empty road instead of at her. Emily didn't interrupt. She listened with her whole heart, sensing this was not a story he shared easily. "I had a life once. A real life. A good one." The way he said it made her chest tighten. He didn't speak with bitterness. He spoke with the kind of longing that only comes from someone who had tasted happiness deeply and then lost it in a way he never expected. "I had a job I loved," he continued. "Worked at a small carpentry shop. I made furniture, little wooden toys, rocking chairs, tables, things that lived in people's homes, things families kept for years. I used to run my hands over the wood and feel proud, like I was building something real and lasting." Emily could almost picture it. A younger Jonathan, strong, smiling, hands covered in sawdust, shaping something beautiful with care. It made it harder to imagine that the man beside her had ever lived such a warm life, but she believed him instantly. His voice carried the truth of someone remembering not just events but feelings. "And I had a wife," he said softly, and Emily noticed the way his eyes softened at the memory. "Her name was Margaret, the kindest soul you'd ever meet. She used to bake cookies for the neighborhood kids even when we barely had enough for ourselves. She believed in me more than I believed in myself. She used to say our little house had more love in it than space." He smiled for the first time since she met him, but it was a fragile smile, the kind that breaks your heart even while warming it. And then, his voice shifted, grew quieter, as if the next memory was sitting heavy on his chest. "We had a daughter, Lily." He said her name like it was a song he hadn't heard in years but still remembered every note of. "She had big brown eyes. Looked a little like you, actually." Emily felt a sudden catch in her throat, surprised by the unexpected connection he drew between his daughter and her. It made her feel closer to his story, like she wasn't sitting with a stranger anymore, but someone whose life had once been filled with love, laughter, and small, ordinary moments that meant everything. "We didn't have much money," he admitted, "but we had enough. Enough to live, enough to smile, enough to dream. I worked long hours, but every night I came home to Margaret's voice and Lily's laughter. My little girl used to run into my arms the second I walked through the door." His breath trembled slightly as his memories deepened. "That was the happiest time of my life. Sometimes I think it was too good to last. Like life gives you this one perfect chapter and then tests how much pain you can survive afterward." Emily felt her heart folding into itself as she listened. She could hear the grief hiding between every word he spoke, waiting for the moment when he finally allowed it to come out. But for now, he only shared the good, the part of his life he cherished so deeply that even after everything fell apart, he still held on to those memories like a treasure no disaster could fully destroy. Jonathan finally looked at her, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of pride and sorrow, like a man who remembered exactly what he had lost and exactly who he used to be. "I wasn't always a burden to the world," he whispered, voice shaking just slightly. "Once I mattered." Emily felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. She didn't cry out of pity. She cried because she could feel the truth in his words, the raw humanity, the reality that anyone, absolutely anyone, could fall if life hit them hard enough. And she didn't know it yet, but the next part of his story would make her heart break in a way she had never experienced before. Part 4. Jonathan took a long, shaky breath, the kind that warns you the story is about to turn dark. Emily felt the change in the air even before he spoke. The softness in his expression faded, replaced by something hollow and heavy, a shadow that had clearly lived inside him for years. When he finally continued, his voice was barely louder than the wind. It all changed the night Margaret died. The words fell between them like stones dropped into deep water. Emily felt the world around her blur slightly, her heart tightening as if it was preparing itself for grief it hadn't even heard yet. She wasn't sick, he said, staring at his trembling hands. There was no warning, no slow decline, nothing you could prepare for. One moment she was laughing in the kitchen, and the next she was on the floor. Breathless. His voice cracked. A heart attack. Just like that. She was gone before the ambulance even arrived. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, feeling tears burn behind her eyes. She could imagine the chaos, the desperation, the helplessness of a moment where everything slips from your grasp before you can understand what's happening. That night destroyed me, he admitted, his voice unsteady. You spend a lifetime building a world with someone, and then life takes them away in a second. It felt like the ground underneath me vanished. He paused, looking away as though facing the memory would shatter whatever strength he had left. And I had to stay strong for Lily, he continued. She was only 17, still just a kid. She needed me to be her father, her support, her anchor, but I didn't know how to do any of that while drowning in grief myself. Emily's breath caught. She could feel the pain of a father trying to stay upright for his child while his own heart was falling apart. I stopped going to work, he said quietly. At first just a few days, then weeks. I couldn't focus, couldn't think, couldn't sleep. I tried to hide the drinking from Lily, but kids know. They always know. He swallowed hard, ashamed. The shop fired me. Bills piled up. And then one night, after another argument I can barely remember, Lily left. She said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore. He closed his eyes tightly as if trying to block out the image. I told myself she would come back, that she just needed space. But days turned to weeks and weeks to months, and then the eviction notice came. He gave a brittle laugh with no humor in it. I lost my home the same year I lost my wife and daughter. Life has a way of hitting you all at once, you know. Doesn't wait. Doesn't give you time to breathe. Emily felt her heart break. Fully, painfully, deeply. She understood now. This wasn't failure. This wasn't weakness. This was a man crushed under grief so heavy it would have broken almost anyone. I didn't choose the streets, he whispered. I never chose this life, it just happened when I had nothing left to hold on to. A cold silence settled between them, filled with the sound of life happening somewhere far away. Distant cars, soft wind, the faint hum of a city that didn't notice when a man broke. Emily reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold, but the small touch carried warmth he hadn't felt in years. Jonathan's breath hitched softly and he didn't pull away. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion she couldn't hide. You didn't deserve any of that. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and in that moment she saw it. The depth of his pain, the years of silence, the loneliness that had carved itself into his very soul. I know I made mistakes, he said, but grief changes a person. It turns you into someone unrecognizable even to yourself. I never meant to push her away. Tears slipped down Emily's cheeks before she could stop them. She wasn't just sad for Jonathan. She was sad for every person who had ever broken under the weight of life. For every heart that had loved deeply and lost harshly. For every parent who tried to be strong while their world fell apart. Jonathan looked back at the ground, his voice fading into a whisper almost too soft to hear. And that's how I ended up here. A man no one sees. A father who failed. A husband who lost everything. Emily squeezed his hand, her voice steady despite the tears. You didn't fail, she said quietly. You just broke. And everyone breaks? Some people just hide it better. Jonathan stared at her, stunned by the kindness of her words. For the first time in years, someone understood him. For the first time in years, someone saw the man he used to be. He didn't know it yet, and neither did Emily. But his next revelation would change her life forever. Part 5. Emily sat there, still holding Jonathan's trembling hand, and it felt as if the world around them had stopped moving. The cold air brushed against her face, but she barely felt it anymore. All she felt was a heaviness in her chest, a deep pull inside her that she couldn't explain. She had come into this moment as a stranger, but Jonathan's story had opened something inside her, something raw and painfully real. It was like she had been walking through her own life half awake, complaining about small frustrations, feeling overwhelmed by little setbacks, forgetting that somewhere out there were people fighting storms she couldn't even imagine. She looked at Jonathan and wondered how many people had walked past him over the years without ever seeing him, how many chances the world had to show him a small kindness but didn't. And it made her think of herself, of the way she rushed through her own life, eyes on the ground or on her phone, never stopping long enough to ask if someone else needed help. It struck her hard that she had become part of that silent crowd too. The kind that didn't hurt anyone but didn't help either. And sometimes that hurt even more. Jonathan didn't speak for a while after sharing his story. He just stared at the street in front of them, breathing slowly as if letting out a piece of the pain he'd held inside for far too long. Emily kept her hand on his, not wanting the warmth to leave him. It wasn't pity that anchored her there. It wasn't guilt. It was something more human, more instinctive, like she knew deep down that no one should be this alone after surviving so much. She thought about her own father, alive and well, someone she could still call whenever she felt lost. She thought about her mother's voice, her brother's jokes, her safe, warm home waiting for her. All the things she complained about sometimes suddenly felt like blessings she had been taking for granted. She felt small, but not in a defeated way, in an awakened way, like someone had opened a window in her chest and let in a truth she didn't know she needed. For the first time, she asked herself honestly when she had last sat with someone without checking the time, when she had last looked into someone's eyes long enough to see the depth behind them, when she had last let her heart guide her instead of routine. She realized Jonathan wasn't the only one who had been sleepwalking through life. She had too, just in a different way. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice shaking a little from emotion she couldn't hide anymore. "I'm really glad I stopped tonight." He looked at her with surprise, as if no one had ever said something like that to him before. His voice cracked when he replied, "I'm glad you did too, Emily," and she believed him. She believed it with her whole heart. In that moment she felt something shift inside him too, like a small, fragile piece of hope had woken up after years of being buried under grief. She looked at the lines on his face, the deep grooves carved by years of hardship, but behind them she saw a man who once built toys for children, a man who loved a woman fiercely, a man who adored his daughter, a man who laughed and danced and dreamed, a man who lost everything, not because he deserved to, but because life can be unbearably cruel to good people too. She felt her eyes sting with tears again, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall slowly, silently, because these tears were not for sadness alone. They were for understanding, for empathy, for the realization that every person she passed on the street held an entire world inside them that she knew nothing about. Jonathan noticed her tears, and his expression softened. "Don't cry for me, Emily," he whispered gently. She shook her head. "I'm not," she said quietly. "I'm crying because I didn't know. I didn't know people carried so much inside them. I didn't know how easy it is to overlook a human being and how wrong it feels once you finally see them." He looked down, touched by the sincerity in her voice. "Most people don't want to see," he murmured. "It hurts to look too closely." "And does it hurt less to look away?" she asked softly. Jonathan's breath caught for a moment and he didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew the truth. Emily leaned back slightly, looking up at the sky as if seeking something there. "You know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I used to think my life was hard sometimes. I used to complain about long work days, about losing sleep, about little things not going my way. But sitting here with you, I feel ashamed of how blind I've been." "Don't be ashamed," Jonathan said in a voice that felt older than his years. "Pain is pain. Yours matters too." But Emily shook her head because it didn't feel that way anymore. Her problems felt lighter, smaller, manageable, while Jonathan's felt like mountains he had climbed alone. She turned toward him again, her heart aching in a way she had never felt before. "Jonathan, you didn't deserve any of what happened to you. No one does. But you're still here. You survived things that would break most people. That makes you stronger than you know." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with something more than emotion. Maybe gratitude. Maybe disbelief. Maybe the quiet, aching hope of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Emily took a deep breath as she felt the moment settle into her like a seed being planted. She knew this night was changing her. She could feel it shifting her priorities, stretching her empathy, opening her heart in ways she didn't know were possible. She wasn't just listening anymore. She was learning. growing, becoming someone who wanted to look a little deeper, stay a little longer, help a little more. She looked at Jonathan one more time, and the truth settled heavily but beautifully inside her. This man wasn't a stranger anymore. He was a reminder of humanity, a reminder of how fragile and precious people are, a reminder that kindness doesn't cost anything, but can save someone who's been drowning alone for years. What Emily didn't know yet was that Jonathan wasn't done. His story had one last piece, a piece that wasn't just tragic but deeply personal, something that would reach inside her heart and pull it apart in a way she would never forget. And that revelation was coming next. Part 6. The night had grown colder, but Emily didn't feel it anymore. She sat close to Jonathan, listening to the small, shaky breaths that escaped him every few seconds, the sound of a man who had cried too much in silence and spoken too little for too long. She could feel something shifting inside him too, like he had been holding a final piece of truth deep in his chest and was slowly gathering the courage to let it out. His fingers tapped gently against the warm cup, not out of nervousness but out of fear. The fear of what this truth would do to him once spoken. Emily sensed it. She didn't rush him. She waited. Jonathan stared at his reflection in the dark window of the bus stop shelter, the outline of a tired man staring back at him, someone he barely recognized anymore. After a long pause that felt like a lifetime stretching between two heartbeats, he whispered something so soft Emily had to lean in to hear it. "I used to sit here," hoping she'd walk by. Emily frowned, slightly confused. "Who?" she asked gently. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "My daughter." Her breath caught. She froze. She didn't know what she expected, but it wasn't this. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing a deeper layer she hadn't understood before. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice trembling. "After I lost our home, I didn't have an address to leave behind. I didn't have a number she could call. So I started coming to places I thought she might pass on her way to school or work. Places I hoped she'd remember." His voice cracked so sharply it pierced Emily's heart. "I just wanted to see her, even from far away, just to know she was okay." Emily felt her chest tighten. She could hear the pain buried under every word, the longing of a father who had lost not only his world but the only person left who made life worth fighting for. Jonathan wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Embarrassed, but Emily placed a hand over his arm gently. "It's okay," she whispered, trying to steady her own voice. "You don't have to hide this." He nodded slightly, but his eyes were far away, lost in memories that still stung like fresh wounds. "Years passed," he said quietly. "People think time heals everything, but it doesn't. Not when the person you love more than your own life disappears because you failed her. Not when every day you wake up hoping today might be the day she forgives you." Emily's throat tightened painfully. She couldn't speak. She didn't trust her voice not to break. "I looked for her," Jonathan continued. "Everywhere. I asked people, walked miles, slept outside schools and community centers hoping she would walk by. But life kept moving forward without me, and she became a part of a world I couldn't reach anymore." His hands shook slightly as he pulled something from the inside pocket of his worn coat, a small photograph. Emily leaned closer as he handed it to her with trembling fingers. It was a picture of a teenage girl with long hair tied in a messy ponytail, smiling shyly at the camera while holding a wooden toy horse, a toy Emily already knew Jonathan had probably made with his own hands. "This is Lily," he said softly. Emily stared at the picture, her heart twisting. The girl's eyes were bright, full of life. She had Jonathan's smile. She had Jonathan's gentle expression. "She was beautiful," Emily whispered. "She still is," Jonathan replied, voice barely holding together. "At least, I hope she is. I hope life was kinder to her than it was to me." Emily lowered the photo slowly, feeling the weight of his loss settle deeply inside her. She looked at him, her own eyes filling with tears. "Jonathan," she whispered, "if you could say something to her now, anything, what would you tell her?" He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the question cut through him. When he opened them, they were filled with a raw, quiet grief that made Emily's breath tremble. "I would tell her I'm sorry," he said, "for breaking when she needed me to be strong, for pushing her away when all she wanted was to help, for letting grief swallow me until I couldn't see the pain I was causing her." I would tell her she deserved a better father, and I wish I had been one. Emily's tears finally fell, quiet and warm. She couldn't stop them. And I would tell her, his voice cracked completely, that I never stopped loving her. Not even for a second. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of truth, full of heartbreak, full of the kind of love that survives even when everything else is lost. Emily looked at him, feeling something deep, something indescribable. It wasn't just sympathy. It wasn't just sadness. It was connection. It was recognition. It was the realization that the man sitting beside her wasn't a stranger who had lost everything. He was a father who still carried love like a wound that refused to heal. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Jonathan," she said softly, "you're not a bad father. You were a grieving one, and grief makes even the strongest people collapse." Jonathan's lips trembled as he tried to absorb her words. Emily continued, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Your daughter didn't lose you because you didn't love her. She lost you because you loved someone so deeply that losing them broke you apart." Jonathan's chin quivered. I just want her to know I never gave up on her." Emily placed her hand on his again, firm this time, not just comforting but grounding. "Maybe she needs someone to help her find you again," she whispered. Jonathan looked at her with confusion, hope, and fear all tangled in his eyes. Why are you being so kind to me?" he whispered, voice breaking. Emily felt her heart twist in ways she had never felt before. "Because someone should have been kind to you a long time ago," she said, "and because nobody deserves to feel this alone." Jonathan's breath shook. His eyes glistened with new tears. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as a homeless man, not as a failure, but as a human being with a heart still capable of love. Neither of them knew it yet. But what Emily did next in Part 7 would change both of their lives forever. Part 7, Emily sat there with Jonathan under the quiet glow of the streetlight, and she felt something inside her shift so deeply that she knew, even without fully understanding it, that she would not walk away from this night as the same person. The world around them seemed to fade, the noise of traffic slowly dying into a distant hum, the cold wind softening against the warmth of the moment unfolding between two strangers, who somehow now felt connected in a way she couldn't explain. Jonathan's confession still hung in the air, raw and trembling, like a wounded bird trying to find a place to rest. Emily felt every word of it in her chest. She looked at the picture of Lily again, the young girl smiling so brightly that it hurt to imagine how much sadness had followed that image. Emily could see Jonathan's eyes watching her closely, not out of expectation but out of a fear so small and quiet it broke her heart. He wasn't asking her for anything. He wasn't hoping for miracles. He had lived too long without them, but she felt something powerful rise inside her, something that felt like responsibility, purpose, and compassion all tangled into one overwhelming feeling. "Jonathan," she said softly, turning to him fully, "I want to help you." He froze. His breath caught. It was as if the world itself paused to hear his reaction. "Help me?" he whispered, almost afraid of the words. "Yes," she said, her voice steady in a way even she didn't expect. "I want to help you find Lily." Jonathan stared at her like she had said something impossible, something forbidden, something he had dreamed about so many nights in silence but never dared to imagine could happen in the real world. His lips parted but no words came out. He just shook his head slowly like he couldn't allow himself to hope too fast. "Emily, you don't understand," he said softly. "It's been years. I don't know where she is. I don't know what she thinks of me. I don't even know if she would want to see me." Emily leaned closer, her eyes shining with determination. "Then let me help you find out," she whispered. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Jonathan blinked rapidly, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. He lifted a shaking hand to cover his mouth as if trying to stop the hope from spilling out too quickly. "Why would you do that?" he whispered. "Why would you help a man you met just tonight?" Emily swallowed a lump in her throat. "Because if it was me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "if it was my father on a cold street, alone, exhausted, carrying years of pain no one cared to see, I would pray someone like me would stop for him. I would pray someone would sit beside him and remind him he mattered. I would pray that he wasn't invisible." Something inside Jonathan broke. Not in the tragic way life had broken him before, but in a softer way, like something shattered and something gentler grew in its place. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs he tried desperately to hide. Emily placed her hand on his back, not to comfort him like a child, but to steady him like a human being who had been carrying too much for too long. "I don't know if she wants to see me," he whispered again. "Then let's find out together," Emily said. "You deserve to know. She deserves to know the truth." Jonathan wiped his face slowly, breathing unevenly. "I don't even know where to start," he whispered, trembling. "I do," Emily said with sudden confidence, surprising them both. "I work near a community center. They help reconnect families, missing persons, people who've lost contact. We can go tomorrow morning. You don't have to walk into that place alone." Jonathan looked at her like she was something unreal, like she was the kind of miracle he stopped believing in decades ago. "You would do that for me?" he whispered. Emily nodded. "Yes, I would. You're not alone anymore." He pressed his hand to his chest as if to hold himself steady, as if the emotion inside him was too big for his frail body. After a long moment, he whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Emily said gently. "Just let me help." Jonathan looked at her again, and for the first time since she met him, his eyes held something other than grief. They held hope. A small hope, fragile and trembling, but real. They sat there in silence for a few more minutes, letting the weight of the moment settle deep inside them. Finally, Emily stood and held out her hand. "Come on," she said softly. "Let me walk you somewhere warm for the night." Jonathan looked at her hand as if it was a lifeline thrown into a dark sea. He hesitated, not because he didn't trust her, but because trust itself felt like a forgotten skill. But slowly, with a trembling breath, he reached out and placed his hand in hers. Emily helped him stand, steadying him as he found his balance. The way he held onto her arm wasn't desperate. It was grateful. Quiet, deeply human. As they walked together down the quiet sidewalk, Emily felt something unusual stirring in her heart. A sense of purpose she had never known before. A feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. Jonathan walked beside her, shoulders slightly straighter than before, as if a small piece of dignity had returned to him just by being seen, heard and cared for. Neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of meaning, full of connection, full of a future that suddenly didn't feel as dark as the past. Emily didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know whether they would find Lily, whether she would welcome Jonathan, whether this journey would end in tears or healing. But she knew one thing for certain. Jonathan would not walk that road alone. Not anymore. And as they disappeared slowly down the dimly lit street together, Jonathan whispered so quietly that Emily almost didn't hear it, "Thank you for seeing me." Emily squeezed his hand gently. "I always will," she whispered back. And for the first time in years, Jonathan believed it.